What's up, YouTube fam? Welcome back to my Nahama Book Club. What is a villain? The bad guy, the evildoer, the darkness and the light. But what do they really do? I mean, what makes them a villain? There's a lot more to them than just a tragic backstory, and honestly, I love villains. I love them probably more than I do most heroes, because they're just so much more complex. So here's my list of 5 attributes that make up a real villain. And as always, I'll list all my sources in the description box. Number 1. Villains do immoral things. When considering what makes someone a true villain, let's start with the most obvious answer. They're the bad guy of the story because they do bad things. But to understand what a bad thing is, first we have to define why those actions are considered bad in the first place. In every story, but especially in fantasy, we usually have a set of morals, and those morals can differ from what our set of morals usually are in reality. But even if the agreed upon general morals of the story aren't rigidly defined, usually we can narrow it down to the basic no-nos that our society understands. Never hurt children, avoid hurting women as much as possible, and innocence is supposed to be protected above all else. Be that innocence of animals, humans, or some other species set for your story. Usually, if a character doesn't abide by at least this basic sense of morality, that's the fastest way that they can become a villain. But sometimes you get the rare instance where this isn't as rigidly respected as we might like it to be, which is where it can get complicated. But often an anti-hero, or sometimes even the hero of the story, can stem from villainous parents, which is exactly what happens in my books. Spoiler alert for anyone who's not familiar with the story. In my series, The Castor Saga, our main character and male lead is referred to as Anthony, otherwise known as Tony. Tony's backstory, though we don't actually unpack the details of that until the second book, is that he was raised by a single father named Victor, who was very strict for unknown reasons. In book 2, we find out that Tony's mom and dad were actually a part of a very dark shadow caster organization whose main goal was to basically breed exceptional caster children in order to turn them into super soldiers and weapons to basically try and take over the world. But when Tony was born, the weight of what they were doing suddenly hit Victor like a brick wall, and this entrance into fatherhood is what made him have a change of heart. Realizing that Tony's mother, Angelica, didn't actually care about him or Tony at all, and was just trying to use Victor's incredible abilities to gain power of her own, Victor took advantage of her arrogance, knowing that she would never expect him to betray her. He waited until she wasn't paying attention, and then kidnapped Tony, took him off-grid, and raised him to be a, more or less, good man. Victor raised Tony in a small town where Angelica would never find them. Ironically, that town ends up being her hometown of Benedict, Oregon. Victor then became a Christian pastor and raised Tony with Christian traditional values in a conservative community where darkness for the most part was pretty much shunned altogether. But ignoring that darkness didn't just make it go away. So when Tony grew up, he inherited a similar darkness to that which his father once knew, including a near identical set of casting abilities which were then suppressed his entire childhood. Never being able to express that darkness or have a positive outlet for it, it boiled up inside him until finally something exploded, and basically he just did something impulsive because he didn't know what else to do. That something was stowing away on the train. Which, if you'll remember, he immediately regretted when the conductor of the train whips out an iron and brands him in the arm. We won't talk about the metaphors behind that just yet. But Tony's backstory is very important, even though you don't learn about it until the second book, because it demonstrates 2 perfect characters, which pretty much all readers, watchers of media, etc., we are obsessed with characters like this across the board in pretty much all forms of fantasy entertainment. His mother, Angelica, is a self-serving, unredeemable villain character who's willing to sacrifice her own children to gain power. And his father, Victor, is an anti-hero who redeemed himself by saving Tony and raising him up to be the amazing man that he is at the beginning of book 1. This combination makes for a very powerful struggle within the character Tony, who is born into a traditional battle of epic good and incredible evil. And it only gets more confusing for him when he meets Meli. Number 2 on our list of villainous characteristics, Villains cause pain and chaos. Every compelling villain thinks they're the hero in their own story. And the realist villains have some sort of arc that shows you what they could have been like as a hero, or what they could have been like until their wickedness and terrible behavior made them spiral into the loathsome creature that they are now. Pain in life is inevitable, but how we respond to it is what defines a hero versus a villain. A very smart person, whose name I cannot remember, once said, a hero gets hurt and says, "The world hurt me, I'm never going to let this happen to anyone else." A villain gets hurt and says, "The world hurt me, so I'm going to hurt it back." In my books, Tony is judged from a young age pretty much all his life for being kind of different and being kind of dark. So when he meets Meli, a young woman similar in age to him who also stands out and away from the crowd, he's immediately drawn to her, regardless of her being kind of extra in a lot of her mannerisms. But in terms of pain, Tony has no desire to hurt anyone, at first. He doesn't want to be like the world that bullied and tortured him. And the one thing that he does have going for him is that he was raised with traditional values. So when other men around them say things or lay hands on his new lady friend, he doesn't even have to think twice about jumping to defend her or himself. He just does. This is what makes Tony a hero in our story and keeps him from being a villain, regardless of the dark, shadowy side of himself that he's exploring as he gets on the train and begins going through the trials. A better example of a character with more of a "the world hurt me, so I'm going to hurt it back" kind of mindset would be the famous Joker character in the Batman universe, especially in the new Joker movies. So let's talk about him real quick. Now, I must preface this next part of the analysis by saying I didn't really care for the new Joker movies. I'm sorry. It's just not my thing. So while I'll try to stay as unbiased about this as possible, just be aware, yeah, I don't really like the new movies. The new Joker movies definitely have an element of "the world hurt me, so I'm gonna hurt it back," which is an epic, fantastic motivation for a dark villain to have. My problem with this is that the original Joker, for example, my personal favorite interpretation would be Heath Ledger. Original Joker was an absolute agent of chaos. While the new Joker leans more on the pain element, old Joker leaned more on the chaos element. Great villains cause upset and drama, usually just for their own, self-interest or their own entertainment. And if they are trying to get a point across, then this is a perfect way to do it. The new Joker movies are a little different from the original idea of Joker because they want us to feel bad for him. They want us to, have some empathy or sympathy for him. But the problem with that is that you're not supposed to feel bad for the Joker. They want us to, but that's not okay. As someone who has a lot of empathy for the majority of people, you are not supposed to have empathy for the Joker. He's supposed to be a whack job who does things solely for the purpose of doing bad things. Joker's not originally depicted as having a victim mentality, and in my opinion, to make him that way this many years later is just lazy, boring writing. In my opinion, they should have ended his movie with him and Harley Quinn sitting on a throne, Harley on his lap, and they're burning a stack of money. Don't make him an "oh, sorry, me" character. That's not the Joker. Victim mentality just doesn't suit the Joker character. But I digress. Back on the topic of chaos, villains who swing a little more as the chaotic evil side of the pendulum usually come off entirely random. They come off as very mixed bag. You don't ever know what you're going to get from them. They're unpredictable and insane, and that's why audiences love them, because they keep you guessing. You never know what you're gonna get. The writing is new and fresh, and it's always exciting. Of course, if you're writing your own character, and you want them to be that chaotic evil, just don't accidentally whiplash your audience. If you're gonna write an entirely chaotic character, make sure something about them is expected. Make sure something about them is baseline. Otherwise, the writing will feel lazy for other reasons. Trait number 3 of all real villains: villains are demonized for their behavior. Often due to being different or having physical deformities or some other kind of erratic, uncontrollable behavior. The villain of a story may become one because of a single attribute that they either can't control or are isolated for having. Beetlejuice, I hope you like my pumpkin, is an exceptional example of this, because not only is he a literal demon, but also because although he can be quite helpful, spoiler alert in the second movie, he's only helpful by happenstance because he has a selfish goal of his own that he's trying to achieve. His behavior is entirely self-serving, and while also having quite a few chaotic tendencies, his most villainous quality is just causing major mischief. While villains often have selfish motives, I would argue that heroes actually can have just as selfish motives. It's what they do and how they go about those tendencies that actually define if they're a hero or a villain. In my books, Tony's concerned about being judged for revealing his darker self because he's had to hide it nearly his entire life. But Meli and the Nahamo siblings have been demonized for nearly an eternity just for living their life the way they want to. So when they take in Tony and kind of accept him as one of their own, they do it without judgment. They take in anyone that they make a friend without judgment. This allows Tony to explore that darker side of himself under the care of people who actually know what they're doing. Now, Meli and the Nahamos are not villains, even though they really like to pretend that they are. They're motivated by selfish reasons, but are entirely selfless when it comes down to the good of the rest of the world, or at the very least, the rest of their family. Whereas you have Tony's mother, Angelica, who's chaotic, theatrical, and just power-hungry in general. The Nahamos teach Tony how to be a real caster. Regardless of having all of this power, it doesn't corrupt them. The number one reason they aren't villains is because they don't abuse their power for evil or selfish intention. They protect themselves and each other, but when good and evil have a standoff, they always defend the side of innocence. Tony has a lot of potential to be really seriously evil, just like any of us do. But because he was raised very well, mind you, by a father who wanted to make sure he was good, and then he goes off and finds a family and finds people that he wants to protect himself, that is what pulls him back from the edge of darkness and allows him to tiptoe in it without actually ever becoming a villain. To outsiders, the Nahamos seem insane. Even Tony admits to being scared of them a couple different times throughout the book series. But once you're in the family and they've claimed you as their own, they put a lot of effort and care into making sure that everyone's safe, provided for, and feels like they can be themselves. And this care is what allows Tony to explore his dark side and even begin to use it to his advantage. Trait number 4 that all villains have an unredeemable event. Everyone who enjoys books, movies, or really any kind of media in general has had a moment where you're watching, say your show or you're reading your book, and you identify with the villain in a way where you're like, wow, they make a really good point. But then one thing happens, and that one thing kind of makes you go, that was too far. Okay, yeah, now I understand why they're a villain. That moment right there is what I refer to as the unredeemable event. If it's a fantasy setting, this is usually where a villain turns into a supervillain, aka Anakin Skywalker turning into Darth Vader. His unredeemable moment, in my opinion, is definitely when he goes in and just all the children. The most innocent group of people who haven't even had a chance to do bad yet. Those people right there are the thing that turn Anakin from a Jedi into a Sith Lord. I think it's safe to say we all would like to think that we'd be given a second chance if we'd really messed up. That being said, massacring an entire group of people or offing women in front of their children, spitting on the innocent kind of just across the board, yeah, there's no coming back from that. These are the metaphorical nails in the coffin that force a character to die a villain. And typically, the character after that doesn't get a redemption arc of any kind. There's no moment where they wake up and realize how wrong they were. That doesn't happen. And if they do, it doesn't usually change their position on the things that they have already done. In my books, Angelica, Tony's mom, her hypothetical point of no return is when she attacks and tries to off her own daughter, Heather, otherwise known as Hev. Tony and the Nahamos gave her every single reason to back down. They literally were like, let us go, let us leave us alone, we'll go in peace. The oldest brother, Jay, warns her over and over, multiple times, we don't want to do this, we don't want to be a part of this, let us leave. And she, whether because of her ego or just straight up arrogance, refuses to listen. Angelica even tries to get Heather and her 2 twin nephews to go off Meli when the brothers aren't paying attention, but because the 3 of them are not evil, they won't do it. They respect Meli's power and her ability to off them back if she wanted to, and so they don't. They side with her instead, realizing, oh, well, we might be a little outclassed here. Wait, you're not mad at us for, like, trying to get you? She literally says, well, guys, if I considered every person who tried to kill me an enemy, I'd have far more enemies than I do friends. And even with this, Angelica still tries to off Meli on her own. And they still would have probably let her go until she went after her own daughter, Heather. When Angelica goes after Heather, suddenly everything changes. Seeing that there's no hope for his mother, he defends his half-sister by basically battling it out himself against their mom to protect Heather. And even at the end of that battle, when he wins, spoiler alert, he lets her live. He says, if you ever take advantage of my good nature a second time, you will not live to regret it. But that rematch never comes because Angelica, in her delusional state, attacks Tony as he turns to walk away. She immediately tries to take out her own son, regardless of him having mercy on her and letting her live. And seeing this, Jay, as the eldest Nahamo sibling, makes a call and is like, okay, nope, we're done. Jay and the middle brother, Joey, in the moment, drain all of the water and liquid out of Angelica's body and then light her on fire and burn her to ashes in a matter of mere moments. Brutal. Because the Nahamos do not play when it comes to family matters. After all, Jay and Joey's dad literally tried to take out Meli when she was a little girl, and so Jay put him in his place and took care of him himself. Angelica was given every opportunity to change. This was her unredeemable moment. Because instead of just not, she crossed the Nahamo's line of unredeemability twice. And that's when they were like, okay, you can't be saved, we're done here. But even with as terrible as Angelica is, she's not the main villain of the story. After all, she dies in the middle of book 2, and there's 2.5 books left after her death. No, the real villain was actually with them all along. But you don't find out who that is until the end of book 4. And so finally, attribute number 5 that all great villains have. Villains explore layers of the self that heroes don't. And no, this isn't a cop-out of like, oh, and the real treasure was the friends they made along the way. No, more so an evolution of that trope. The real villains were the demons they created for themselves. I call them the anti-Nahamos, as on the nose as that may be. Because contrary to popular belief, even with our society's victim mentality and sense of blaming everyone but yourself, hate to tell you the truth, but you are your own worst enemy. Heroes work to overcome their flaws, whereas villains are destroyed by theirs, often without the hero ever even really having to do much. Villains are complicated because people are complicated. And that's why we love them so much, because it's way more easy to relate to a flawed character than an idealized character. It's easy to relate ourselves to a villain because villains don't have to put in any work to be better. And this is where my series really comes home and hits all of the major points that I'm trying to introduce to people in hopes of making our society and world better in a fun, fantasy expressing kind of way. In the 4th book of my series, Meli, the author, is losing control of the story. The sky's falling around them, stuff is happening that she doesn't expect, because her own mental health is like spiraling into chaos. Tony has to step up and help Meli defeat her anti-Nahamic self, not because she's too weak to do so, because she's been fighting for so long, she's so tired. And also, it's okay to ask for help sometimes. We don't have to fight every battle on our own. And well, he loves her. She helped him face his own inner demons. But now her inner demons have manifested physically right in front of them. Well, sort of. In terms of mental health, sometimes the root of the issue isn't exactly what you think it is. In fact, Tony and friends help her beat her demons, but then after they do, that's when her and everyone else realizes, someone else is pulling the strings here. And that's when she realizes something's not right and that someone else is influencing the story. And there's only one other person who could be doing that besides her. Meli faces off with that person, her inner villain, all by herself. And Tony and the brothers just kind of have her back, just in case she does need them. That is when she becomes Meli Red and takes back all of her power to defeat the big villain, or in video game terminology, the final boss. Real villains, true evil, doesn't change. In fact, most of the time it kind of implodes in on itself. But these characters can teach us a lot about ourselves and other people. They can help us to become better versions of ourselves if we're willing to put in the work, because everyone is the hero of their own story. And figuring out what type of hero you are can really help you to live that glorious, amazing, wonderful life that you want, that you absolutely deserve to have. There are actually 5 main archetypes of hero that we see today in popular culture. So if you'd like to learn about those 5 types, go ahead and click over here to see the video I made about my favorite fantasy trope, the 5-man band. Thank you all for watching. I love you all so much. See you in the stars.